Caucus web meeting. I'm Lisa Hanairo with the Council of State Governments, and I'll be managing the logistics for today's web meeting with assistance from Caitlin Ty, also at CSG Midwest. The caucus's annual meeting is the major event each year for interacting and conducting business, but not all members can attend. The caucus holds these quarterly web meetings, timed around the annual meeting, to give members regularly scheduled opportunities over the course of the year to stay apprised of issues the organization has been tracking and to call attention to emerging issues that the members might wish to track. The web meetings also are useful for updating the members on GLLC activities such as upcoming events and opportunities to sign on to member letters. These web meetings are one of the benefits of membership in the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. We'll start by previewing the agenda. First, I'll go over some of the housekeeping instructions so that you all will know how to interact with the speaker. Senator Darwin Boer, the Vice Chair of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, will give the welcome and introductions, and then we'll hear from our featured speaker, Santina Wortman of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. After the presentation, we'll convene a short business session during which members will get an update on some developments with the GLLC leadership, and then I'll review some of the events and activities that you all can look forward to in 2018. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Boer. I hope his line is open. Senator Boer, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful. All right, Senator Boer, you have the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would just apologize because the normal connection that I would have from my office is not working properly, so I'm using my cell phone. So I want to thank everyone for attending here today. I know that we're going to get some really good information for all of us here later. But I would like to go over a couple of things. The chair, Representative Corey Mason, is unable to attend this webinar today, so I'll be filling in as the vice chair of the caucus. I want to acknowledge at this time that our past chair, Senator Ann Rest from Minnesota, she will be on the line as well. Thank you, and good morning to Ann and all the rest of the attendees. I'll give you a little background as I know it here from a caucus. It is the only bi-national, nonpartisan organization dedicated solely to the education and the engaging in state and provincial legislators from the Great Lakes. The goal of the caucus are to facilitate the regional exchange of ideas and information on key Great Lake issues. Our job, I think, is to strengthen the role of the state and provincial legislators in the policy making process and promote the restoration and the protection of our Great Lakes. Membership in the caucus stands at about 238 enrolled members, representing the 8 states and the 2 Canadian provinces that make up the Great Lakes region. Peer-to-peer outreach from caucus members is the best way to recruit new members who care deeply about the Great Lakes. I highly encourage all members to reach out to your colleagues and specifically to reach out to each legislator on both sides of the aisle, because it is important for us to remain a nonpartisan organization. In January, Lisa will be emailing the GLLC brochure, the current roster, and a link to our online enrollment form to all caucus members. Please consider forwarding this information to any colleagues that you think might be interested in joining us. Today, our featured speaker, today's featured presentation will focus on harmful algae blooms in the Great Lakes and what's being done to prevent them. Recently, we learned that the blooms affecting western Lake Erie this past summer was the third largest on record. Thankfully, the bloom didn't result in any municipal water systems being shut down, like what happened in Toledo in 2014. But the toxic green slime covering 1,000 square miles from Toledo to the North Shores in Ontario. Such an extensive bloom is a stark, vital reminder that we need to be doing more to keep polluted runoff out of the lake. This past Tuesday, the International Joint Commission released its triennial assessment of progress on Great Lakes water quality. The report was the first one prepared under the amended Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the U.S. and Canada, which the two parties revised in 2012. The IJC found that the water quality of western and central Lake Erie remains unacceptable, while Lake Erie rightly receives so much of the attention related to the harmful algae blooms. It's important to remember that this problem isn't confined to one body of water. Green Bay in Wisconsin, for example, is struggling with this same problem, as are other bodies of water. Here today to help us understand what is being done to address this problem is Santina Foreman from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Great Lake Program Office in Chicago. Ms. Foreman is a physical science working on nutrients management and non-point source control program. She has a lead role in coordinating with Canada and the states to fulfill the objectives of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Specifically, the development of phosphorus reduction targets and domestic action plans to minimize harmful algae blooms in Lake Erie. She also assists with budget planning, prioritizing, and selection of non-point source control projects under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Ms. Foreman has a Master's of Science in Earth and Environmental Sciences from the University of Illinois. This is her first time speaking on one of our web meetings, so let's all welcome Ms. Foreman. You have the floor, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to have the chance to talk to you today and to share with you the progress that we're making under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. I hope this presentation I have has a lot of information in it. So for some of you, it may be some information that you already know, and I didn't know, to the level that you might know all of these things. So I'll go through it pretty quickly though, and that way you'll have the presentation. And if you'd like more details, and you can always follow up with me with any questions afterwards as well. So let's go ahead and jump in. We have a long history of working together with Canada on the Great Lakes, and the original Water Quality Agreement was signed in 1972. Back then, the problem was also algae growth, which then kind of abated in the 80s and then kind of came back again in the late 90s. So most recently, the Water Quality Agreement was amended in 2012, and that was to kind of uphold some of the original commitments while also identify some of the emerging issues like climate change and invasive species, in addition to the work that was already being done under the original Water Quality Agreement. On the next slide, just to give you a sense of how we've structured this work, there's 10 annexes, which are basically like chapters of the agreement. They're each focused on different topics. So I primarily work on Annex 4, which is the Nutrients Annex. Each of the annexes are co-chaired by a federal agency, and the nutrients annex is co-chaired by Environment and Climate Change Canada and the US EPA Great Lakes National Program Office. And then the work of each of the annexes is overseen by a Great Lakes Executive Committee. And that is co-chaired by US EPA and Environment and Climate Change Canada. That committee meets twice a year. They're actually meeting next week in Toronto. And the work that's conducted under the annexes is overseen by the IJC, which, as Senator Brewer mentioned, they had just released their report very recently assessing our progress. So their role is really to provide oversight to the governments and evaluate how well we're doing at meeting the agreements that we laid out in the agreement. So the next slide, to give you, just to reiterate again, and we do have this algal bloom issue in more than one of the Great Lakes. We have it in Green Bay and Saginaw Bay, but our focus is really on Lake Erie because it is the most impacted. And this is just showing you from our 2016 assessment of nutrients. We do every 3 years a State of the Great Lakes assessment, and that assessment found that when it comes to nutrients in algae, Lake Erie continues to be in poor condition and is deteriorating. So next slide, as far as our charge under the agreement, we were charged to basically look at our existing nutrient targets for the waters of the Great Lakes. We had before loading targets for each of the Great Lakes and concentration-based targets as well. And we were supposed to look at those and evaluate whether or not they're still adequate to prevent harmful algal blooms and also related issues, nuisance algae and hypoxia. So if the targets were no longer working and we needed new targets, we were supposed to establish new targets and then allocate those loads between the US and Canada. We're also charged with identifying priority watersheds for reduction and then develop phosphorus reduction plans for the US and Canada. We're also required to monitor and report progress every 3 years under the progress report of the parties under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Next slide. To give you a sense of who's involved in this work, this is showing our subcommittee members. We have basically each of the state agencies that's in the Lake Erie Basin, so Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and New York. We have from those states the agricultural and the environmental agencies. And then on the federal side, we have EPA, USDA, NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. We also have some municipal organizations, and we have our supporting science type agencies for like NOAA and the USGS. And then a lot of the work that the subcommittee oversees is supported by work groups that have a lot of academic and NGO type organizations involved. So it's really a lot of collaboration and a lot of organizations involved in this work. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of the timeline, the agreement laid out that we were to, starting with Lake Erie, review those phosphorus targets and establish new targets if necessary by 2016. And so we did that. In 2016, we established new phosphorus reduction goals for Lake Erie. And now we're working on the next goal, which is to have the domestic action plans not later than 2018. And I'll be talking a lot more about that today. Just to give you a little bit of context for Lake Erie and the algal issues there, we hear a lot about the toxic algal blooms in the Western Basin, and that's definitely kind of the highest priority issue and the most, visible problem. But there's other algae problems in the lake as well. The lake has 3 basins. The Western Basin is very shallow and very warm, and that's why part of the reason why it's so prone to having those toxic algae blooms. In the Central Basin, you actually end up having sometimes seasonal hypoxia in the summer, which is when the bottom waters become starved of oxygen as the algae die and decompose. And so then that creates dead zones where fish have to basically avoid those low oxygen zones. And then in the eastern basin, which is very deep and cold and has much lower nutrient levels in it, we still have a lot of algae growth on the bottom, on the substrate, and that type of algae is called cladophora. So it's like a filamentous kind of stringy, very thick mats of it will grow on the bottom, and then they'll slough off and wash ashore, and they're just a big nuisance, and it smells bad when that happens. It's usually more of an issue on the northern shore and on the Canadian shore in the eastern basin. So the challenge, yep, that's fine. This challenge in developing our reduction goals was to address all three of those issues in the lake. And so you may have heard a lot about the 40% reduction target that was set, and we actually have multiple targets to address these different issues. So it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But we basically identified that for the harmful algal bloom issue, the Maumee River is really the primary driver of that in terms of the loading coming in from the Maumee. And it's really the spring loading that's coming in. And it's not just kind of regular phosphorus, but the dissolved form of phosphorus, which is more available to the algae. So we have a series of targets. And so to control harmful algae, we really need dissolved phosphorus during that springtime when the algae can, really feed on it in the summer and really bloom. And then this hypoxia issue that I mentioned in the Central Basin, for that, you just need to reduce the loading overall during the year. So an annual loading reduction to the Western and Central Basins. And then we didn't set a target yet to address that nuisance algae cladophora growth in the Eastern Basin yet. The science just isn't quite developed enough yet for us to be able to do that, but we're continuing to actively research and try to, we're going to be doing some enhanced monitoring over the next few years and research to try to do that. Next slide. So that's our goal, is the series of 40% reduction targets. And then the next step was to develop those action plans to identify how those reduction goals would be met and what needs to happen. So what we've done on the U.S. side is each of the states wanted to lead the development of those action plans, which makes sense since they each have kind of different authorities and programs that they can leverage in their state to achieve those reduction requirements. So each of the states, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, developed their own action plan for their state. New York did not, because they're in the Eastern Basin. Remember, they don't have a reduction goal yet for that Eastern Basin side. But then all the 5 of the states, including New York, we basically wrote an overarching plan, which is our U.S. action plan. That's a compilation of what each of the states are doing. And then it also has our federal agency actions, and it tries to provide kind of the overarching, what's the overarching strategy for the basin and how we're going to track progress in the basin. And this is just listing here all the agencies involved in writing that plan. Next slide. So the goal of this overarching plan is we wanted to, really articulate what are the federal versus the state agency commitments, identify potential needs for programs or new policies. We wanted to provide focus for allocation of our resources, establish accountability, and again, a consistent framework for tracking progress. Next slide. Just to some of the key points in terms of achieving those phosphorus reduction goals is that there isn't, one single solution or one thing that we can do that we think is going to achieve that goal. It's pretty complicated, and what we know so far, at least from the studies that have been done that have shown kind of the potential for implementation of agricultural best management practices in the basin, is that this reduction goal is possible if we have very widespread adoption of these best management practices and if they're targeted to where they are needed the most. It is a bit of a daunting task, though, in terms of the level of implementation that's really needed to achieve those 40% reduction goals in an area like the Maumee River, which is a very, very highly agricultural, intensively drained area. So We know that we have to kind of continue and accelerate and ramp up the kind of voluntary incentive programs that we offer to farmers. And we also know part of the challenge is that most of that phosphorus is coming from non-point source runoff. So it's when you have a rain event that washes soil or washes nutrients or fertilizer off the landscape. But what we're seeing is, obviously an increased frequency in very intense rain events, and that it's not just reducing, the amount of fertilizer that gets applied, but we actually need to look at managing that water itself to manage the load, because so much more runoff is happening. That's part of the reason why we have more phosphorus getting delivered, is just because we have basically more rain. So we're looking at the water management side of it and the nutrient management side, and we know that we need not just one practice, but really like systems of practices. So if a farmer can reduce what they're doing to apply the fertilizer, but then there's also something like a buffer that captures that runoff before it goes into the stream, like a treatment train. That's the kind of thing that we need to happen. We need to see happening a lot more across the landscape. Next slide. So in terms of the plan, this is the type of information that's in this plan. It has the different sources, loads, and allocations by watershed and by state. We have some goals set out because, as I said, they've got some differences between the western, central, and eastern basins, so different types of goals that would apply. For each plan, we summarize at the state level, who are the major partners and what are the actions, what are the major milestones, and how are they going to measure progress. And then next slide. Similarly, for the federal programs, we identify kind of the major federal programs and the major activities and milestones that the federal agencies are taking. And so just to give you a sense of who's involved at the federal level, it's primarily EPA and USDA leading a lot of the implementation of nutrient reduction projects. And then we have a lot of really important supporting science work being done by USGS and NOAA. The Army Corps of Engineers is also doing a lot of important, I would say both the supporting science and they're really interested in building, wetlands that are more optimized to control phosphorus. But we have a lot of federal programs, and this graph here is just showing that, in terms of the amount of resources that we bring to bear, there's a lot of funding going into the area, and it's already been ramping up over the last few years. So if you're familiar with Farm Bill funding, the Natural Resources Conservation Service has, their voluntary incentive programs for farmers, and they've basically doubled the amount of funding that they're offering to farmers in the Western Lake Erie Basin since 2016. So that's a new initiative that they have, and it's a very targeted initiative. Next slide. This is just to give you a sense of how the information is presented as far as, we have for each kind of set of activities a very specific, set of objectives. We lay out the cost of those activities, who's involved, the time frame, and the milestones to be achieved. And we've categorized our work into three kind of buckets, which is, projects that are really doing that source reduction or that water management on the ground, the monitoring, assessment, and applied research, that supporting science piece, and then the third being our activities to improve our programs or assess our programs. Next slide. We really wanted to focus on, as far as, again, what the federal agencies could bring to the table is trying out some new things and looking at innovative technologies and approaches. So there are a number of efforts underway, particularly by USDA and NRCS. They have some new best management practices that they're developing. They have one that's an actual, it's a phosphorus kind of filter bed. It has a special type of material that absorbs that phosphorus, and it's a structure specifically designed to treat for phosphorus. There's also a lot of work to do kind of edge of field monitoring, which we know is really important for farmers to, one, kind of trust that you know, what we're recommending to them is going to work and actually see the data behind it. And it's just a really important tool for us to be able to understand and improve then the design of those BMPs to make sure that they are actually working the way that we think that they will. We're looking at this picture here at the bottom shows kind of the different types of drainage practices. And these aren't, you know, these are not very popular. This is kind of, it's very hard to get a farmer to want to do something like this. It usually requires them taking some land out of production, and you can see they're like structural things. So it's, you know, a matter of controlling that water or having the water go into a buffer where it sits for a while before it gets released, or even in the third case here, it gets recycled back onto the field. That's kind of like an ideal situation. And we can't do this everywhere, but we want to pilot these types of things to see, you know, how far we can really take those kind of technologies. So those are just a few examples. On the next slide, I want to kind of close with some of our expected outcomes from this work. So one issue is that, you know, we know that the lake could respond quickly to those reductions once they occur. And the graph here is showing you the algal bloom severity since 2002. And you can see that we've had a number of very significant blooms in the last 10 years. But in years like 2012 and 2016, where we had basically kind of almost like drought conditions and very little runoff, we had a much smaller bloom. So that tells us that, you know, it really is responding within a short time frame to those inputs from those tributaries every year. Obviously, the challenge, though, is to achieve that 40% reduction and to have that occur during our wet years. As I said before, you know, the load is increased in part just because we have an increase in discharge. And the other challenge in this is that we are really relying on voluntary actions by private landowners. And I think, you know, having that level of adoption of these types of practices that are necessary is going to take some time. So the next slide. So in our plan, you know, we're not very specific about when we will achieve the 40% reduction target, and those are some of the reasons why. Here's just to give you a sense of what the bloom would look like if the reduction goals were met. We have a baseline year of 2008, and the picture on the left shows you what the image looked like, the satellite imagery of the intensity of the bloom in 2008. Well, in a year like 2008, which was a very wet year, if the reduction goals were met, we would expect it to look more like the picture on the right, and that would be like the new normal. And there still would be blooms in Maumee Bay and Sandusky Bay, and there would still be localized impacts, but it wouldn't be a bloom that extends into the, you know, towards the islands and into the Central Basin. It would be much, much reduced. And we do still expect, though, that if you have, you know, once every 10 years, probably you'll have a really high flow year that even though you've reduced your phosphorus inputs, you're still going to have a significant bloom. And that's the exception that showed on the bottom. So in that case, one of the worst years like 2011 would look more like a 2008 year. Next slide. Okay, so there's, and I've already indicated that, you know, we're not very clear in our plan when we'll achieve the 40% reduction goal and the challenges around doing that. We did attempt to provide a projection of what we think the current programs in place will achieve. So this is really based on the major federal programs to do phosphorus reduction. So the NRCS work, we have programs under the Clean Water Act to do grants with farmers. We have grants under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And we basically took that work, those projects that already have been funded basically or committed to, and we tallied up the projected amounts of phosphorus reduction from those. We also have a significant reduction coming from the Detroit wastewater treatment plant. So taking all of those things together, we think we can reduce about 2.5 million pounds of reduction to the lake. Well, we need about 7.3 million pounds. And then this timeline here, this is kind of like a fundraising chart. So we want to fill that up by 2025 is the goal. And that's a goal, the 2025 year, you may be familiar with this, that Ohio and Michigan and Ontario signed on to what's called the Western Basin Collaborative Agreement, where they agreed back in 2015 that they would work to achieve these 40% reduction goals by 2025. And they also had a interim kind of aspirational goal that they want to get halfway there by 2020. So this fundraising chart is meant to show you that, okay, we need to get, if we're going to get to 50% by 2020, from what we can tell of what's happening, and this is not including all the state programs, and also a lot of voluntary adoption that we don't have a good way of tracking. This is just showing you what we've basically paid for and the work that Detroit Wastewater Treatment Plant did. And that, shows potentially a shortfall of, 1 million pounds more to get halfway to their goal. You can look at this a few different ways. I think when we went out for public comment on this, the environmental groups were very critical in that it shows a big shortfall and that we're not going to get there. We actually thought it showed that it is feasible and that we clearly have a significant amount of work to do, but that, it's meant to just show like what level we need to happen outside of federally assisted programs. And again, it's very difficult to provide certainty around these numbers and these time frames. Next slide. So just to summarize our commitments on the US side, that 7.3 million pounds that we need to reduce is a lot. The priority is the Maumee River, since that's what's driving the blooms. We're going to use those years, those 2020 and 2025 years as benchmarks. So we're going to be, tracking progress towards those and checking in and employing adaptive management. So if we find that in 2020 we're nowhere close, we're going to be looking at, changing our strategy. We really want to leverage GLRI funding to the extent we have GLRI funding, and any other funding opportunities to support the implementation of the state action plans. We are working with the Great Lakes Commission. The federal and state agencies are working together to develop a system for for the public to have access and be able to track our progress through a project called Erie Stat. That'll be a publicly available website where folks can go on and see how we're doing with regard to the targets. And we've also committed to doing at least annual webinars for the public. And we also have to do every 3 years our progress report to the parties through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Next slide. As far as the time frame to finalize those action plans, we have final plans from Pennsylvania and New York. Everyone's gone through public comment at this point. Michigan and Indiana are still revising their plans. We're working on our response from the federal agency standpoint, our response to comments. And so over the next couple of months here, we're going to be working to finalize that plan. And again, it has to be done by the end of February of 2018. And that's all I have. I know there was a lot of information. I hope that was the kind of information that you find useful, and I'm glad to answer any questions people may have.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Senator Boer. This is Lisa. I just wanted to jump in and thank Santina, and also let everyone know, I apologize for skipping over the housekeeping. If anyone has a question to ask, please go ahead and use your, there should be a hand icon on your GoToWebinar control panel. You can raise your hand and I'll unmute your line, or you can type your question into the questions pane. Back to you, Senator Boer.
Thank you. And Lisa, you will watch for those hands and those that want to ask questions. This is a lot of information, and but a lot of good information for us in the states. Mine being Michigan, where we're looking at a final plan. Is there anything, while we're looking for other questions, that we as legislators can speed up this progress in any way? I know it's pretty hard to achieve these timeframes, but is there things that we might be able to do?
I think that each of the state plans does a pretty fair job of laying out, what the current regulations or state authorities and programs that they have can really accomplish. And I think that the approach right now is to basically just try to push those programs as far as we can, and try to get a better understanding of whether that's really going to be adequate. I mean, a lot of the criticism we've received so far from like the IJC or the environmental groups is that they want to see more enforceable standards. They want to see more regulations on agriculture. And I don't think that, in some way, in some places, I don't think we know yet if that's necessary. If, I think the premise right now is that the states have a lot of existing regulations that could be enforced better. And that if we kind of ramp those up and enforce those programs and really expand the voluntary program adoption, they're hopeful that we'll make significant progress. But I'm really thinking that in a few years we'll have a much better sense of how far those programs can really take us. It's a little bit difficult to say right now, but that's the kind of thing we've gotten a lot of feedback on in our public comment period.
Thank you. Lisa?
Yes, we have a written question from Representative Kurt Vanderwall. His question is about fertilizer runoff. Is there a superior buffer plant we should be encouraging farmers to use?
Buffer plant, like a certain type of plant?
Yes.
Or
plan. You can answer it both ways. Yeah, plan or plant.
Oh.
Well, he's saying yes, like hemp.
Oh, okay. I am not so familiar with the details of like which type of plants, are best at uptaking the phosphorus. I am familiar with a study by Don Scavia at University of Michigan Water Center, where he looked at, they try to look at different scenarios, and they looked at what if you kind of converted some of the corn to switchgrass or something like that, or cereal rye, and it would, some plants will draw down the phosphorus levels in the soil. Part of the problem is, I think we've had over application in the past. Even if it stopped now, the phosphorus levels in the soil are high. It's going to take a long time to draw them down. So there is a lot of interest in looking at, well, what types of crops or plants could draw that phosphorus down. I don't know as far as buffers if, which plants are like more effective than others at capturing runoff. But to be honest with you, any expansion of buffers I think would be good, because I don't think we have a whole lot of buffered streams in this part of the country.
Okay. I have a question, but first I wanted to just remind everyone you can raise your hand, or like Representative Vanderwall, you can type in your question in the questions panel. And for those of you who may be listening on your phone, but you're not accessing the slides, I can't unmute your line to hear you. So if you do have a question, go ahead and tweet it to @GLL or you can email it to me. Best way to do that is gllc@csg.org. But my question was going to be about, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement relies on the prevention principle. And I'm wondering, are there any data available to compare the actual cost of dealing with these harmful algal blooms with the potential cost of the different measures to prevent them? You mentioned the 3 different approaches to controlling runoff. I can understand why it would not be attractive to farmers to have to take these steps themselves, even if some funding is provided for that or it's subsidized. But do we have any data on what it would cost for someone like the federal government or the states to fund those infrastructure projects to capture the water versus what it's costing them to deal with the effects of the phosphorus getting into the lakes?
Oh, that's a really good question. We do have some data on that. One study that was done recently, I believe by the IJC, was assessing the costs that algal blooms have caused, and so basically, well, what would the cost savings be to prevent algal blooms from happening in the future because of all the costs associated to the drinking water and the reduction in tourism and recreation and things like that. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was a pretty significant amount in the millions of dollars that could be saved by preventing the blooms. And then, I think we have some information about how much we're spending on kind of voluntary cost share. We know that farmers are already investing a lot of their own money and time into these types of practices. So I think there's been a study by USDA that showed that, something like, I don't know, a couple $100 an acre or something, farmers are already kind of investing in this type of work. I have been interested in your question in terms of, could we kind of offset that by having some kind of wastewater treatment, like an infrastructure-based treatment for the agricultural runoff. They did this in Idaho on the Boise River. There's a special project there, and I think that's something worth exploring. But the magnitude here of the runoff itself and the phosphorus reduction that would be needed is so large that I think it would be a very significant infrastructure project to try to build a treatment plant for that. And the other issue is just having the land area to do some of this. So it's pretty complicated. I don't have a lot of information, but I do think there are some studies in that direction, and certainly something that we want to continue to collect more information about to understand, what are really going to be the most cost-effective ways to achieve the reductions.
Okay, thank you. We do have a written question from Senator Matt Dolan of Ohio. Are you familiar with any programs or companies which skim off or remove the algae blooms once they bloom on the water?
Let me think. I'm not sure. In Ohio, since they've been having these issues, they've had kind of a lot of different companies kind of come out of the woodwork and saying, well, we have a solution for you. We can fix your algae bloom problem. And they actually have a system set up now where they have, if there's a company that has a suggestion for something like that or proposal, they have a vetting process through the state. I know that I say that because they have this process, which means they must be getting that kind of request, but I'm not that familiar with what those types of technologies would be. Again, in the Maumee, I think if you look at Toledo, they've invested so much now in upgrading that the drinking water plant there. I don't think you're going to see a toxic issue again there because of how they've improved their treatment. So even if they continue to struggle with the toxic blooms, I don't think you're going to have a drinking water outage. But it would be hard to, I think, kind of remove it from the water over such a big area. This is a really large. I was out on the lake this summer and I couldn't believe. We went out on a boat and it just goes out for miles and miles, and it's a lot of algae. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for that answer. And Senator Brewer, it looks like those are all the questions that we have time for. If anyone does think of a question they'd like to pose, you can email it to me at gllc@csg.org, and I'll pass it on to Santina for answering.
Thank you, and I want to thank you from the Great Lakes Water Caucus again for that information. And again, if other members have other questions, certainly get those to Lisa. If you would like, we're going to go into our business session right now, and so if you'd like to stay on and listen to that portion of it, that would be great. Or else, I know you're busy as well, and we will proceed with our business portion of our caucus today.
Okay, thank you.
So to our members, we'll go right to the business session. At the start of this webinar, I mentioned that I'm filling in today for our chair, Corey Mason. He's a member, of course, of the Wisconsin Assembly. Representative Mason was first elected as chair of the Great Lakes Caucus at our 2014 annual meeting in Quebec. He has served very capable as chair since that January 1st, 2015. He was on the executive committee from 2013 to and 2014, so he was well in position to take the chairmanship of this organization and this caucus. Representative Mason is the third chair of this caucus. The first GLLC chair was former Michigan Senator Patty Burkholz, who I knew quite well. A founder of the caucus and its leader from the very beginning in 2003 until she left the legislature. Senator Rest was the first chair elected after the caucus adopted the rules of this organization in 2012, and we certainly thank her for that. Chair Mason has been planning to attend today's web meeting, but he was called away on business. As many of you know, that this past October, Representative Mason was elected by the people of Racine, Wisconsin, to be the city mayor. He took office in November and announced that he will resign his assembly seat on January 15. Although he'll remain a legislator until that date and therefore eligible to continue as chair, he has informed us that he is stepping down from this position as GLLC chair effective today. While we are sorry to see Representative Mason move on from our caucus, we're very happy for him and we wish him all the best in his new role in the executive branch of government. We know he will do an excellent job and that our loss truly is the city of Racine's gain. Many of us toured North Beach and other sites in Racine during our caucus in 2016, which was our annual meeting in Milwaukee. As a mayor of a fine Great Lakes city, Representative Mason will continue to be a strong advocate for the Great Lakes. Under the rules of our organization, as vice chair, I will succeed automatically to the position of chair. Representative Mason will serve on the executive committee as a past chair until he leaves the Wisconsin Assembly in January. The position of this vice chair will remain vacant until our next meeting, which is scheduled for September of next year. I'll be consulting with the members of the caucus executive committee to determine whether it would be advisable to hold a special election on our next web meeting to fill the position of vice chair for the remaining of this term, which would run through the end of 2018. I recognize that I have substantial shoes to fill, as did Representative Mason when he succeeded Senator Rest as chair. Each chair has grown the organization and has increased its profile as a forum for the Great Lakes advocates, which I hope to do all I can in that regard while I hold that position of chair. We legislators have an extremely important role. We have the power to establish policy and appropriate funding for programs that restore and protect the Great Lakes, that provide our citizens with access to safe, affordable drinking water, and that help our jurisdiction sustain existing businesses and industry and attract new ones who will responsibly use the vast resources that we have in the Great Lakes. We have come a long way since our founding in 2003. We have evolved from an ad hoc group of few dozen like-minded legislators to a structured, active organization of over 200 members. We have come a long way, and yet I know we have only just begun to tap our full potential as a forum for regional action. Representative Mason and Senator Rest and former Senator Burkholz have brought us to the point we're at now. It's my job and the job of whoever succeeds me in 2019 to continue to guide the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus toward a strong future. It's the only binational, nonpartisan forum for the Great Lakes legislators. For legislators who not only want to learn about the problems that affect our Great Lakes, but who are committed to working together to solve those problems. Fortunately, I have the help of our very dedicated and capable executive committee. The executive committee is planning to convene a strategy planning meeting in April so that we can continue the discussions we began in Toronto about our organization's future. We'll be developing a policy agenda focused on issues we think present the best opportunities for regional collaboration. We'll also be addressing our need to diversify and secure the financial resources we need. CSG Midwest has done a great deal with generous support from the Joyce Foundation, but we can't rely on the goodwill of just one foundation to keep us going. If we want to grow as a forum, we need the staff, the financial resources to do that. We will likely be turning to our membership to assist in whatever way they can, whether it be to refer us to potential funding partners or to take the initiative and reach out to contracts at foundations or corporations and encourage them to sponsor our organizations. At our strategy planning, as our planning proceeds, we'll keep caucus members informed about our plans and what the members can do to help. Is there any additional remarks anyone wishes to make at this point? I would tell you that yesterday, the Senate of Michigan passed a concurrent resolution to support the recommendation of the United States Army Corps of Engineers to prevent Asian and other invasive carp from entering our Great Lakes. That was done effective yesterday. So we continue to push on that issue. There's no other remarks at this point. I will turn the floor back to Lisa. So Lisa, from here, I guess yes. I'll let you go ahead with the events and activities that we're looking forward to.
Yes, thank you, Senator Boer. And before I get into the activities, I want to read from a statement that Representative Mason provided last night regarding his resignation. He said, and he asked me to read this on today's call. He said, "It was my hope to join you at this for this final meeting of the caucus before my resignation occurs. However, I've been in Boston at new mayor's training this week and will be returning home on an airplane while you are on your call. I want to thank the members for the opportunity to lead this organization for the last 3 years. It has been such an honor to get to know so many wonderful legislators from the 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces that call the Great Lakes home. I'm so proud of the work this organization has done to keep things bi, or even multi-partisan. The lakes need that kind of advocacy if we are to successfully protect them for posterity. I will continue my advocacy for the Great Lakes now as a mayor, and it is my sincere hope that I will meet you again on the water's edge somewhere on the Great Lakes." So, all right, Caitlin, we can move on now to the 2018 events and activities. So the caucus has quarterly web meetings scheduled on March 2nd and June 1st. Both are Fridays, and they'll be at the same time, 9 a.m. Central, 10 a.m. Eastern. I'll be sending web meeting announcements approximately 1 month before each event, so please hold these times for now. The next regularly scheduled election of officers and members of the Executive Committee will take place on September 22nd during the caucus's 2018 annual meeting in Erie, Pennsylvania. The elected members will serve 2-year terms beginning January 1, 2019. In May, I'll be putting out a call for volunteers to serve on the nominating committee that'll recommend a slate of candidates for election. The nominating period will run from June 20th through July 20th, and members of the nominating committee should not be planning to run for any position. I'll provide more information on the election process and eligibility requirements in May when I issue the call for volunteers. And then Senator Boer, as chair, will appoint the members of the nominating committee in late May. The caucus's 2018 annual meeting will take place in Erie, Pennsylvania at the Sheraton Erie Bayfront Hotel on September 21st and 22nd. That's a Friday and Saturday. We hope once again to be able to offer travel scholarships to GLLC members who need them. We'll know whether we'll have scholarships available before we open early registration for members on June 1st. In addition to electing the new leadership, members will have an opportunity to propose and vote on resolutions during the meeting. And then in connection with the annual meeting, the caucus will be hosting a one-day Great Lakes Policy Institute on September 20th. A limited number of GLLC members will be invited to attend this session, which is a pilot for a longer institute that the caucus hopes to establish as a biennial activity in the future. The purpose of the institute will be to foster regional collaboration on key issues such as ensuring the safety and affordability of drinking water or preventing nutrient pollution, as our speaker addressed today. And I'll have more details on the Institute and we'll share those with you in the spring. And with that, I want to thank everyone for attending, and remember that the recordings of this web meeting and past events are available on the GLLC website, and I will send that link to everybody later today when we are done. I will also send the information on the Great Lakes Executive Committee meeting that our speaker mentioned. It's taking place next week in Toronto, but it will be webcast. And so I'll share that information in my post-web meeting message to you all. And then please watch for periodic member updates to come from me by email. I send these updates only to Great Lakes Legislative Caucus members. They're my way of disseminating important information to the members regarding events, sign-on letter opportunities, and other matters. If you aren't receiving these, please email me at gllc@csg.org so I can make sure I have the most up-to-date contact information for you. And now I'll turn it back to you, Senator Boer, to adjourn the meeting.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and it looks like we're running very close on time, but I hope our colleagues will agree that this has been informative and useful web meeting. I also hope you will plan to attend our next web meeting on March 2nd at the same time. With that, I would just say I would wish everybody happy holidays, and I extend my best wishes, and hopefully our families will gather and enjoy the holidays. With that, if there's no further business, the meeting will be adjourned. Thank you all for attending.